Okay, so imagine a place like in the Horn of Africa, a region we always hear about conflicts, instability, but there's this place, right, where it seems like peace and democracy are actually working.
Yeah, that's Somaliland.
Somaliland. So that's what we're diving into today.
It's really a unique situation, you know, not your typical story of, oh, a region wants to break away. It's not like that.
Yeah. So we've been looking into this, right, reading up on Somaliland, and the big question we have is, like, why does it even matter if they get recognized internationally?
I think that's the core of it, yeah. Because recognizing Somaliland, it could have these huge ripple effects, like throughout the whole Horn of Africa. I mean, we're talking about stability in the region, global trade, even counterterrorism, all impacted.
And this is happening in a place where, like, all the big players are involved already. The U.S., China, the EU, they're all kind of,
Oh, yeah. The Horn of Africa is, well, it's a geopolitical hotspot, to put it lightly. And then you add Somaliland's location to that, like right on the Loch of Aden. It just adds another layer,
So much complexity. So to even start to get this, we have to go way back, right, to their history, which, to be honest, I didn't know much about before we started prepping for this.
Definitely. You can't understand where they are now without knowing their past. And what's interesting is that Somaliland actually got their independence from Britain, like way back in 1960.
Whoa, really? Before Somalia? I had no clue. So then what happened?
So they get independence, right? And then they decide to, unite with Somalia.
To form the Somali Republic.
Right, exactly. The idea was that, unity brings strength. It'll be good for everyone. But things didn't really work out the way they hoped.
Yeah, I'm getting that sense. So what went wrong?
Well, there were internal conflicts, power struggles, all that. And it escalated, sadly. It turned into a really brutal civil war. And in the end, the people of Somaliland, they were facing oppression, violence. They decided to take back their sovereignty in 91.
So this wasn't just some, like, spur-of-the-moment thing. It was going back to something they'd already had, right? Like a restoration.
Yeah, exactly. And that's really important to understand how they see it. This wasn't about breaking away. It was about restoring what they felt was already theirs.
It's complicated. Like, when we think about self-determination, post-colonial Africa, nation building, all that, how does that fit into this whole thing?
You hit the nail on the head. Those are the very themes that make Somaliland's story so important. You see it across Africa, the effects of colonialism. Borders drawn without regard for, reality, cultural, political, and then you get the tensions, conflicts. Somaliland's a perfect example of how messy it all is.
And to make things even more interesting, they had that referendum in 2001 where, like, almost everyone voted for independence. So they've basically been doing their own thing ever since.
A de facto state, you could call it. They operate like an independent country, but they don't have that formal recognition. And that creates a whole other set of problems, especially for things like trade and international relations.
So, okay, they have this history of independence. They clearly want to govern themselves, and they've been doing it pretty well for decades. It's like, why not recognize them then?
Well, that's a question with a lot of layers. Historical stuff, geopolitical concerns. There's worry about setting a precedent for other regions that want to break away. We'll get into all that later.
But for now, let's talk about maybe Somaliland's biggest strength. Look around. Their neighbors are dealing with so much conflict, and yet they're stable. They have regular elections. It's actually a democracy.
Yeah, it's incredible when you compare them to the surrounding countries. Really. Look at Somalia, where they declared independence from. Devastating civil war, extremist groups like Al-Shabaab.
And somehow Somaliland has kept all that out. Created a functioning society. How did they do that?
I think it's a few things. They've kept some of their traditional ways of governing, consensus building, conflict resolution, things like that. And then they've also put resources into local security, community policing to keep things in check. Seems to be working pretty well.
Yeah, it really is remarkable how they've managed to keep things stable. Like an island of peace,
And that stability, that lets them actually focus on their economy, right? Like I was reading about how Somaliland, they have a lot of potential, especially for things like trade and investment.
Absolutely. Their location, like right on the Gulf of Aden, it makes them perfect for trade. And their port in Berbera, it's already attracting a lot of attention from international companies.
So when we say potential, what does that actually look like? Like, what industries are we talking about? What are the big opportunities there?
Well, one of the main things is livestock. They export a lot of camels, sheep, goats, mostly to the Middle East.
Really?
Oh, yeah. It's grown like crazy in the last 10 years, 15%. So a lot of Somalilanders depend on that, for income. 15%, that's huge. But it's not just livestock, right?
Right.
What about the port, the one you mentioned in Berbera? How does that fit in?
That port, it's really key to their whole economic future. It's a deep water port, so it can handle the big cargo ships. Makes it a great link between Africa, the Middle East, and, the rest of the world.
So this is like global trade routes kind of stuff.
Exactly. And there are already major players investing in it. DP World, they're a global port operator. They've put in over $400 million to expand and modernize it.
Wow, $400 million. That's a serious investment.
It is, and it shows how important Berbera could become, like a major hub for the whole region.
And I remember reading that Ethiopia is involved too, right?
Yeah, you're right. They're landlocked, right. But their economy's growing fast, so they need a reliable way to get their exports out, and they see Berbera as the solution.
So they have a stake in the port too.
Yeah, they signed a deal to get a piece of it. Shows you how strategically important this all is.
Seems like everyone wins then. Somaliland gets investment, Ethiopia gets a trade route, it's all good.
Could be, yeah. It's definitely got potential. But like anything this complex, there are also downsides, risks to think about.
Okay, yeah. Up to now, we've been pretty positive about all this. But what about the other side? Like, what are the things that could go wrong for Somaliland?
Well, the big one, of course, is that they're not recognized internationally. And that makes it hard for them to, do a lot of things. Get access to finance, foreign aid, they can't really have formal diplomatic relations with other countries.
It's like they're trying to play the game with one hand tied behind their back.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Makes them vulnerable too, They can't count on the international community for support the way other countries can.
And on top of all that, there's Somalia, right? Like they still claim Somaliland as part of their territory. They don't want to let them go.
That's a big hurdle. Somalia's been really clear. They oppose any kind of recognition for Somaliland.
So no matter what, that has to be dealt with.
For sure. The relationship between them, it's complicated. Some people say that recognizing Somaliland could actually make things worse, like destabilize Somalia even more and lead to new conflicts.
That's scary. I mean, we don't want to create more problems, right?
No, absolutely not. Any solution, it has to be carefully thought out. The impact on everyone needs to be considered.
But even with all of that, it's hard to ignore what they've accomplished, right?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to security. I mean, the Horn of Africa, it's just full of terrorism, extremism. But Somaliland's different. They've managed to keep groups like Al-Shabaab out, which is more than Somalia can say.
Totally different story there. They've been really good at keeping things secure. Al-Shabaab, they control a lot of Somalia, carry out attacks all the time. But in Somaliland, it's peaceful. No extremist influence?
It seems impossible, almost. Like, how did they do that?
Well, their approach to security is different. They focus on community engagement, intelligence gathering. They work closely with traditional leaders, clan elders, people on the ground who know what's going on.
So it's more like bottom up instead of top down.
You could say that. They've got strict border controls, too, and they've invested in training their security forces. Being proactive, working with the community, that's been key to keeping them safe.
Sounds like they really get it. Security is everything. Without it, you can't have a functioning economy. You can't have progress.
Right. And it's allowed them to focus on other things, too. Building their democracy, improving infrastructure. They've created this environment where people can actually thrive, not just survive.
Speaking of democracy, they've had multiple elections that were actually free and fair. Like, that's pretty rare in that part of the world. How do they pull that off?
It really is impressive. They went from a system based on clans to a multi-party democracy. They have a parliament that actually works, an independent judiciary, a pretty free press.
It's like they're the model for how to do democracy right, especially in a region where authoritarianism is so common.
Yeah, they're showing that it's possible, even in tough conditions. International observers have even praised their elections, how they transfer power peacefully between different parties.
But it's more than just elections, right? It's about creating a culture of democracy where people are engaged, they hold their leaders accountable.
Absolutely. And Somaliland's done a good job there, too. Their civil society is active. They have all these NGOs and community groups that are pushing for change, making sure the government does what it's supposed to do.
So it's a system where different voices can actually be heard. People have a real say in what happens in their country.
That's the goal, right? And while no system's perfect, Somaliland's commitment to these democratic ideals, it really shows their progress. They could be like a beacon of hope in a region that really needs it.
I mean, it's amazing how much they've achieved. With all the challenges they face, they're still committed to peace, democracy, building their economy. It's really inspiring.
And you have to remember, they've done all of this without being recognized officially. Imagine what they could do with the support, the legitimacy, if the world acknowledged them, you know?
It's like they've had to be twice as resourceful, twice as resilient just to get by. Because the system, the international system, it hasn't really made space for them.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. They've had to create their own path, their own solutions. And they've done a remarkable job, really.
But we also have to be real, right? Like, not everyone agrees that recognizing Somaliland is the right thing. There's the argument that it could cause more problems than it solves, you know? Make things unstable, maybe encourage other groups to try and break away.
Yeah, that's a valid point. You can't just ignore those potential consequences. It's not a decision to be made lightly, that's for sure.
It's a lot more than just a yes or no. Geopolitics, the concerns of Somalia, the African Union, all of that has to be considered.
It's complicated. There's no easy answer. But one thing's for sure, Somaliland's story, it really makes you question what you think you know about this region. It's not all conflict and instability, clearly.
Yeah, it proves that peace is possible, democracy can work, and their economy can grow, even in the toughest environments.
Yeah.
It makes you think about how our current systems internationally, maybe they need to change. They're not really equipped to deal with places like Somaliland.
Right. The whole idea of statehood, self-determination, what does that even mean in today's world? Those are big questions that Somaliland brings up.
So we've covered a lot, right? The history, what they've accomplished, what the risks are. At this point, it's really up to each person to look at all this and decide what they think.
That's what we hope people get out of this deep dive. We're not trying to tell anyone what to think. It's about thinking critically, having those conversations about global issues that matter.
So why should anyone listening care about Somaliland? This place most people probably never even heard of. What's the takeaway?
Well, I think it's important for a few reasons. First, it makes us realize there's a whole world out there beyond the headlines, right? We need to look deeper, try to understand different perspectives.
Like, go beyond the surface. There are so many untold stories.
And Somaliland, they're a great example of resilience, self-reliance, what humans can achieve even when the odds are stacked against them.
They built something from nothing, basically.
Exactly. And finally, I think their whole struggle for recognition, it forces us to ask, what does it even mean to be a country? What about the right to self-determination? How does the international community need to change to address these situations?
It makes you rethink everything, our systems, our assumptions.
So as you go about your day, think about what stuck with you from this conversation, what resonated with you about Somaliland.
Yeah, and how can we apply what we learned here to other places, other conflicts around the world?
Somaliland's story, it's really a testament to the human spirit, the drive to create a better future. It deserves to be heard, understood.
And we hope this deep dive gave you a good place to start. If you want to learn more, if this sparks something in you, go explore it. A complex issue, for sure, but it's fascinating.